This weekend's shipwreck video will be a bit of a break from the others. We'll be giving the Iron Bottom Sound wrecks a rest and turning to a much more understated theater of war, the Gulf of Mexico, where only a few U-boats operated during the war, though their efforts spooked American leadership, for good reason with how close this was to home. Today we'll be looking at one of those submarines, U-166, sunk on July 30th, 1942. In most circumstances, this wouldn't be a particularly famous boat. She only sailed on 2 patrols and sank less than 10,000 tons between 4 ships. Not a great success, as it were. However, due to her sinking, this submarine is pretty well known, at least in the shipwreck community, both for her sinking location and for the historical controversy at the heart of the story. Something that really needs a dedicated video, of course, but that can come later. The short version is this. U-166 left France on June 17, 1942, on a long-distance voyage. Her second war patrol, following one at the start of the month that stuck much closer to home. This was quite a bold move for what was a largely untested boat, to say the least, even if the Type 9C was fully capable of long cruises. In any case, the boat's captain took her towards the Gulf of Mexico. U-boats had been stalking the American coast after the United States entered the war, but the Gulf was a dangerous place to sail, and U-166 would pay the price. By the end of July 1942, she had sunk 3 small vessels, and on July 30th, she sank her 4th and final victim, the steamer Robert E. Lee, escorted by the submarine chaser PC-566. Fortunately, only 1 torpedo hit the steamer. As a result, most of the passengers and crew were able to evacuate. Only 15 passengers and 10 crew were lost out of 407 souls aboard the ship. U-166 would not be so fortunate. PC-566, under the aggressive command of Lieutenant Commander Herbert Claudius, attacked the U-boat. The little submarine chaser moved in on the boat from outside the submarine's line of sight. Depth charges were dropped, with the crew of the submarine chaser spotting debris and oil. Claudius made the reasonable claim that he had sunk the submarine based on this. The Navy was less reasonable about it. Clearly, some amateur couldn't have possibly sunk a U-boat on his first try. Further issues arose in a Coast Guard aircraft spotting and attacking a U-boat the same day, relatively close by. They also reported hitting the target, so the aircraft was credited with sinking U-166 and her 52 crew. Claudius was removed from command and disgraced, for what, as it turned out, was a completely accurate claim. Because in 2001, after decades of that plane having credit, the wreck was located. At the time, there was a survey of the seabed prior to laying a natural gas pipeline, a fairly standard affair to ensure they don't lay the pipe on some undiscovered obstacle, be it natural or a shipwreck. This survey by CNC Technologies found the wrecks of both Robert E. Lee and U-166 very close to each other in 2001, at a depth of around 5,000 feet or 1,500 meters, far too close to reasonably be a result of the Coast Guard, which attacked their submarine over 100 miles away. As it turned out, that boat was U-171, which happened to be in the same general area. She escaped damage and left the area. Deep Sea Detectives had an episode on this, so I'd recommend finding it if you can. very little has actually changed on the wreck in the intervening years. Also, if you want to compare to anything in this video, U-505 is the same type of U-boat. Both U-166 and U-505 are Type 9C, though the latter is from later in the war. As for U-166, her bow has been blown off, either directly from the depth charges or as a result of secondary explosions. Regardless of which it was, this tore free and drifted a fair bit away from the rest of the hull. Close enough that it had to have happened relatively late, but far enough to not be right beside the main hull. I'd say it's by far the more damaged part, but that's only because we can actually see that damage. Because even in 2003, when first surveyed in detail, U-166 was buried. I'll often say a wreck is buried deeply in one of these videos. U-166 is special even by that standard. She's just about the most buried wreck I've ever seen, with silt covering almost the entire forward part of the main hull. Even the aft portion is buried up to the deck. It's quite an interesting look, to say the least, and a good point to shift to the wreck itself. For today, we'll mostly be focusing on a survey by Nautilus back in 2014, 11 years ago now, and also 11 years after that first survey. Ironic, I suppose. Regardless, the submarine, as of 2014, was in excellent shape. At least the visible portions were. The wreck showed little in the way of deterioration, with most pieces still plenty recognizable, as you can see here starting at the stern. A good portion of the deck is missing, and the sub is, of course, buried. But the parts that are visible, those aren't showing much rusting or the like. The parts that are missing might well have been blown off during the sinking. It's tough to say because we didn't get a great look in 2003. That said, when you look at the anti-aircraft gun, a 37mm for those curious, this becomes more apparent. Those missing deck plates look like they're missing. There's not much in the way of rusted out portions. Just clean squares where plates used to be. And some railing here and here, further demonstrating how far the mud has overtaken the wreck. But back to the 37mm gun. This hasn't changed much, if at all, since it was photographed much earlier here. The same applies to the deck as much as we can see it in the earlier image. There doesn't seem to be much more missing, though the parts that are missing give an excellent glimpse of the internals of a U-boat. However, moving to the stern, we do have some of the rare rust damage. It's more apparent here. Some of the deck has very clearly rusted away, not been blown off during the sinking. As we move further forward, the conning tower comes into view. Again, more of those missing plates are visible on the deck, while the conning tower itself shows no visible damage. It's pretty rusty and dirty, yes, but not damaged. You can even see the vents on the side next to a perfectly intact ladder. And above that, the tower's railing. Even the marine life is fairly minimal. There's some growth on the railing and barrels of the guns, but that's about it. Quite different from, say, USS Independence. Of course, when you move closer in, it isn't quite as pretty. More of that rusting is apparent. Although, despite this, the details are still quite clear, including a better look at the other anti-aircraft gun. A single 20mm gun carried at the rear of the conning tower. I normally note how this is pointing up, but in this case, that's the default orientation for the weapon, so it's not particularly special. The condition of the conning tower clear from top to bottom, definitely is, either from the aft here or from the bow here. Some of the shielding has rusted away on the front, but beyond this, there's very little damage, even if there is a stretch of marine life here. Meanwhile, when you move up on the conning tower, we get a better look at the tower itself. There's a lot less silt and mud up here, giving a good look inside. We have the Uzo mount here. That was a binocular targeting device for surface attacks. Beside it is the mount for the periscopes, and further back, the partially extended radio antenna. We see all three bits of equipment better here, with the Uzo in particular here. The actual binoculars are missing, leaving just the mount, while the periscope is in the down position. Well, one of them is anyway. The other one is partially extended, just like the radio antenna, which is bent back at an angle. Something more clearly visible here, along with intact grating. Not even this thin metal rusted through. We can also see the other side of the tower, where a large vent is just behind the periscope, and a couple other things of note when looking closer. A distinctive hole in front of the tower here, and just behind it, a bit has rusted through. One of the few clearly visible rusted out parts on the wreck. Meanwhile, as we move further down, there's not much difference compared to the other side of the tower. It's in generally the same shape. Pretty rusty, yes, but not rusted out. After this, we move higher up to look at the tower in more detail. There's really surprisingly little silt all told. It has buried most of the deck, but still. The tower itself is visible in all its rusty glory. The next couple images round that off from closer in, with more vents and another intact ladder, and a look at the front here, including that chain of marine growth. That finishes off the conning tower, and indeed the parts that aren't buried. All that's left, at least here, is the 105mm or 4-inch deck gun. This is almost completely buried. Only the barrel and some of the upper part of the mount sticks out of the mud. Mud that has covered everything else, including the break where the bow fell away. That said, the gun itself, pretty much perfectly preserved, right down to the plug to keep water out of the barrel. That applies from the tip of the barrel back to the breech. It's not damaged, and everything that isn't buried is still in place. Despite what must be some pretty severe damage beneath the mud, the gun is fine. You can see all the gears and the like, along with some debris ahead of it here poking out of the mud. At any rate, though, we'll wrap up the main hull here, with the back end of the 105mm gun clearly visible. And now we can wrap up the video with the mangled bow. And I do mean mangle. This section here is where the break was. It's a twisted mess of metal from whatever caused it. Implosion, teared off from depth charges, or secondary explosions. It's apparent from behind, and it's apparent from above here. Very little is recognizable back here, other than rusted debris. Here, there's a lot more rusting than on the main hull, even if it's still less than you'd expect, though that extra rusting is to be expected. When metal is damaged for any reason, it weakens the structure, and weakened metal rusts faster. You can see that from above here, along with more blown out deck plates. We see that better in this image. Those blown out plates are quite similar to the main hull, showing another look inside the boat, and how relatively intact it is ahead of the worst damage. The further forward you go, the less damage there is. aside from the blown out panels. Though it does seem, in addition to a lot of rusting, the very tip was broken off. Meanwhile, on the other side, we can see two details of note. A rusted out section here, and just ahead of it, one of the dive planes, barely poking out from under the mud. That said, with little in the way of detail to point out here, I'll wrap things up now, with this image of Nautilus's ROV looking down at the wreck. Much like with Peterson, it seemed a good place to end the video. A light illuminating the resting place of 52 brave men, and what might be our last good look at this wreck. A 2019 survey noted increased deterioration in the aftermath of the Deepwater Horizon spill. Unfortunately, not much material was released from the survey. That said, the point remains. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.